It had been unplugged for 31 years. That October morning, it turned itself on. And through the static, faint, breaking apart the way voices do at the edge of a signal, it said my name. That's the part one still can't explain. It had been sitting in the same corner of my workroom for 31 years, unplugged, dusty, the kind of old that stops looking like neglect and starts looking intentional. A Zenith console from 1952, dark walnut cabinet, the dial yellow to the color of old paper. I hadn't touched it since the morning I carried it in from the boat shed and decided I'd restore it someday. Someday. I'd been a lighthouse keeper's wife for 22 years. You learn, in that life, to stop questioning things that happen at the edge of the water. Fog that appears from nowhere. Ships that show lights where no ships should be. Clocks that lose time only in certain weather. But that Tuesday morning in October, when I walked past the workroom and heard something coming from that corner, a voice, faint, breaking apart between static like words dissolving in salt water, I stopped in the hallway and held my breath. Because the voice was reading a name. And the name was mine. My name is Iris Calloway. I'm 73 years old and I live in Pelican Shoal, North Carolina, a village of 400 people perched on the edge of a peninsula that sticks into the Atlantic like a question mark. Most people here have never left and have never wanted to. I understand that. The water does something to you if you stay near it long enough. It gets into the way you think. My late husband Byrne was the last civilian lighthouse keeper at Cape Shoal Light before the Coast Guard automated everything in 1991. After they took over the light, Byrne built boats. Small ones, careful ones, the kind that last. He died in 2017 at 78, and he left behind 3 finished boats, 11 unfinished, a workroom full of tools I don't know how to use, and that radio. He never told me where it came from. That had never struck me as strange until the morning it turned on without being plugged in and said my name. I stood in the doorway of the workroom for a long time. The light in there was the particular gray of an October morning on the water, not quite dark, not quite bright, the kind of light that makes edges uncertain. The radio sat where it always had, on the low shelf between Byrne's router and a jar of rusted screws. The dial was lit. Faintly, amber, the way a coal goes right before it dies. The voice had stopped. Just static now. The kind that sounds, if you listen long enough, like breathing. I walked over and put my hand on the cabinet. Warm. Not from the morning sun, the window faced north. I crouched down and looked at the cord. Still coiled. Still unconnected to anything. And yet the dial was lit, and the static breathed, and somewhere inside 31 years of silence that radio had found something to say. I should tell you that I am not a superstitious woman. I am a practical one. I kept a lighthouse running for 22 years, which means I understand weather systems and radio frequencies and the way old wiring can do unpredictable things when the salt air gets to it. I know that electronics can behave strangely near the coast. I know all of that. But I also know what I heard. And so I went to the only person in Pelican Shoal who might have an answer. Del Moreau ran the only hardware and marine supply store in town. He was 81 years old and had been repairing electronics in the back room of that store for 50 years, and he had the kind of face that suggested he'd seen everything and classified most of it as either interesting or not interesting, with very little in between. When I described the radio, he put down the hinge he'd been oiling and looked at me properly. Zenith console? Walnut? 1950s? 1952, I said. Byrne had it in the workroom. Del was quiet for a moment in a way that felt deliberate. Byrne's had that radio a long time, he said. 31 years that I know of. Longer than that. He picked up the hinge again. Where'd you say it came from? I don't know. He never said. Something shifted in Del's expression then, not alarm, not surprise, but a careful settling, the way a man looks when he's just confirmed something he'd long suspected but never had reason to say out loud. He set the hinge down on the counter and didn't pick it back up. He stood very still for a moment, looking at a point somewhere past my left shoulder. Whatever he was deciding it slowly. When he looked back at me, his eyes had that quality they get sometimes in old men who've lived in a small town long enough, like they're holding a map of something you don't have the coordinates for yet. Del looked at the hinge for a moment, then set it back down. Maybe you should bring it in, he said. Let me have a look. The way he said it, not curious, not surprised, just measured and careful, told me that Del Moreau already knew something about that radio. He just wasn't sure yet how much to tell me. I brought it in the next morning in the back of my truck, wrapped in a moving blanket. Del carried it into the back room himself, which told me something. He usually made younger people do the heavy work. He set it on his bench and looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then he opened the back panel with a screwdriver from memory, the way a doctor examines something familiar. I waited. Somebody's been into this recently, Del said. What do you mean recently? Last year or two. These connections here, he pointed to something I couldn't quite see, they're clean. Not original. Someone replaced them. I felt something shift in my chest. Burn, I said. It wasn't a question. Probably burn, Del said. He pulled out a small component and held it to the light. This is modern. Somebody retrofitted a short-range transmitter into the cabinet. Disguised it to look like original parts if you didn't know what you were looking for. I sat down on the stool by the door. Burn wired a transmitter into an old radio. That's what it looks like. Why? Del set the component down. He was quiet for long enough that I understood he was choosing his words with care. How long was Burn sick before he passed, he asked. About 8 months that we knew about. And those last months, did he spend much time in the workroom? He had. I'd assumed he was working on the boats. He always worked on the boats when he was thinking through something. It was just his way. Del reached into the back of the cabinet and came out with something small. A folded piece of paper, old masking tape along one edge. He held it out to me without opening it. This was tucked behind the new component, he said. I think he meant for you to find it. I think he just didn't know how long it would take. I didn't open it in Del's back room. I walked home first. Down Harbor Road, past the fish house and the post office and Mrs. Adair's picket fence with the morning glory that had been growing through it for 20 years. Past the bench where the old men sat in the afternoons to watch the water and argue about weather. Past the boat ramp where Burn had launched every boat he ever finished. The wind off the water had that edge to it that October brings to the Carolina coast, not quite cold, but pointed, like it wants you to pay attention. I sat on the front steps of the house and opened the paper. It was a single page. Burn's handwriting, smaller than usual, he'd been losing feeling in his hands by the end. It said, Iris. If you found this, it means the radio finally decided to wake up, which means something probably jostled the circuit. I rigged it to broadcast on a local frequency for about 30 seconds when the internal temperature changes, warm spell after cold, that sort of thing. I wanted something that would only go off in October. I wanted you to find this in October. I know that's complicated. That's me. I need to tell you about the radio. I need to tell you where it came from. In 1968, before I knew you, before the lighthouse, I was 19 years old and I did something I've never told another person. There was a man on this peninsula named Thomas Hale. He lived alone in the house at the end of the Shoal Road. He was old, seemed ancient to me, though he was probably 70. He had no family. He didn't come to town much. One winter I noticed his mail wasn't being picked up. I knocked on the door and he answered and he was not well. I started bringing him things. Food, mostly. Company, sometimes. He didn't ask for it and I didn't make a production of it. It just seemed like the thing to do. He died in February of that year. He had no one. His house went to the county. But before he died, he called me to his bedside and he told me the radio had been in his family since 1952. He said he had no one to leave it to and that I was the only person who'd been kind to him in years and so it was mine now. I've kept it ever since. Not because it works. Because of why he gave it to me. I'm telling you this because I want you to know, what you do for people without an audience watching, those things don't disappear. They go somewhere. They take a shape. Thomas Hale has been in this house every year since 1968 in the form of that radio. That's not nothing. There's more to this. But I want you to find the rest of it yourself. Ask Del what he knows about Thomas Hale's house. I love you, Iris. October was always my favorite month with you. Burn. I sat on those front steps until the wind picked up enough to make my eyes water, which is what I told myself it was. I went back to Dell that afternoon. Thomas Hale, I said. Dell didn't look surprised. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they've been waiting for a specific question. Thomas Hale's property, he said. That house at the end of Shoal Road. County took it when he died in '68. And then what? Sat empty for about 15 years. Then a family from Raleigh bought it, fixed it up, rented it out for summers. Changed hands twice more. He paused. Third family that bought it, you might know them. Moved here full-time about 12 years ago. Young couple with a daughter. I thought. The Vines, I said. Callie and Marcus Vine. Their daughter is the one who comes to the community library on Tuesdays, Dell said. Elena. About 12 now, I think. He was looking at me with the particular patience of someone who has decided to let you arrive at the destination yourself. Byrne knew them, I said slowly. He used to stop at that house, Dell said. Check in on them when Marcus was working offshore. Brought things sometimes. I don't think he ever explained why he had a feeling about that particular house. I stood there with Byrne's letter in my pocket and understood that he had spent years quietly watching over a house that once belonged to a man who had given him a radio and changed how he understood what kindness was. He never told me. He never made it a story. He just kept going. Callie Vine answered the door with flour on her hands and the expression of someone who had not been expecting company but didn't mind. She was in her late 30s, dark hair, the kind of capable stillness that comes from raising a child in a small town mostly by herself while her husband worked 6 weeks on and 2 weeks off. I'd spoken to her at church events, at the fish fry in the summer, in passing the way everyone in Pelican Shoal knows everyone in passing. I'd never been to her house. I explained about Byrne. About the letter. About the radio and Thomas Hale and the fact that my husband had apparently been making quiet visits to her property for years without either of us quite understanding why. She listened without interrupting. When I finished she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can you come in?" The house was warm. A wood stove going in the corner, something in the oven, the smell of coffee that had been sitting a little too long. The walls of the main room had been taken down to the original boards, old pine, gray-brown with age, the kind of wood that only comes from a house that has stood through 100 Atlantic winters. In the corner was a small shelf. And on the shelf was something I recognized immediately. A photograph. Black and white. A man I didn't know sitting in a chair with a radio on the table beside him, walnut cabinet, the particular curved dial of a 1952 Zenith. That was here when we bought the house, Callie said. Left in the attic. We didn't know who he was. We kept it because, I don't know. He looked like someone who'd been happy here. Thomas Hale. Sitting with his radio. In the room where, 60 years later, Callie Vine made bread and her daughter did homework and Byrne Calloway had quietly let himself believe he was keeping a kind of faith. I sat down at her table without being invited, which I think she understood. Byrne used to come by, she said, pouring coffee without asking. In the first years especially. Brought wood sometimes, in winter. Looked at the roof once after a storm and said he'd send someone, and he did. I never knew how to explain it except that he seemed to think he had some kind of obligation to this house. He did, I said. He just never knew exactly how to explain it either. We sat for a while. Outside the window the bay moved in long gray swells, October light flat and clean above it. After a while her daughter Elena came home from school. 12 years old, serious eyes, the habit of reading the room before speaking that some children have and most adults spend years trying to relearn. She looked at the photograph on the shelf and then at me. "Did you know him?" she asked. "No. But my husband did, in a way. And your house did." She considered that. "My mom says old houses remember things," she said. "I think that's right," I said. I took the radio back from Dell's shop the following week. He'd cleaned it up, polished the cabinet, replaced what needed replacing, got the original receiver working again alongside whatever Byrne had added to the inside. "It'll pick up AM stations now," Dell said. "And it'll still do whatever Byrne rigged it to do, though I imagine it already did what it was supposed to." I drove it to Callie's house on a Sunday morning. She looked at it for a long time when I set it on her porch. "I can't take this," she said. "You can," I said. "It came from this house." It was Thomas Hale's. It should have stayed here to begin with, but it needed to take a trip first. It had to teach Bern something before it could come home. Elena was standing in the doorway behind her mother. She slipped past and put both hands on the walnut cabinet and looked at the dial. "Does it work?" "Del got it working properly. It should come in fine on clear nights." She looked up at me. "What station did the man listen to?" "I don't know," I said. "But you could find out. Turn the dial slowly. See which frequency feels like it belongs in that house." She nodded, very seriously, as if this were a reasonable instruction. Which, I suppose, it was. I walked the long way home. Up past the lighthouse. They keep it painted now, a historic preservation thing, though the light itself is automated and has been for 30 years. The tower still looks the way it did when Bern and I moved into the keeper's cottage in 1979, two young people who had no idea what a lighthouse actually asked of you and found out by staying. I sat on the breakwater for a while and watched the water. I thought about Thomas Hale sitting alone in that house with his radio in 1968, and a 19-year-old boy who knocked on his door because the mail was piling up and it seemed like the right thing to do. No audience. No reason except the basic one. I thought about Bern in his workroom in the last months of his life, hands going, working in the early mornings while I slept, wiring something careful and complicated into an old cabinet because he wanted to leave me a question he knew I'd follow to the end. I thought about Elena putting her hands on that walnut cabinet and asking what station the old man used to listen to. Some things in this life can't be explained in terms of what they're worth. The radio was worth nothing. It was worth 31 years of a good man's memory, and 60 years of a house that remembered who had been kind inside it, and one October morning when a frequency came alive in a cold room and said a name. I walked home in the last of the afternoon light. The house was quiet. The workroom door was open the way I'd left it. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table. On the table I'd put Bern's letter, the one Del had found behind the transmitter. I read it one more time. Then I folded it carefully and put it in the small wooden box where I keep the things I need to be able to find. Outside, the October light was doing what October light does on this coast, going gold and low and long across the water, the kind of light that has no practical purpose except to make you stand still and look. I stood still and looked. Bern had been gone 6 years and he had still found a way to walk me through a door I didn't know was there, into a room I didn't know was waiting. That is the particular genius of people who love quietly. They keep finding ways to be present long after you've stopped expecting it. The following Tuesday I went to the community library. Elena Vine was there with 3 other children, doing something with a map at the big table. She looked up when I came in and waved in the brief, serious way she had. I waved back. I found a seat by the window and opened my book. And somewhere across the village, in a warm room in an old house with pine walls the color of winter, a 12-year-old girl was slowly turning a radio dial, listening for the frequency that felt like home. If this story reminded you of someone you loved or something they left behind, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you have a small keepsake, a letter, an object you could never part with, I'd love to hear about it.